Before I tell you what I found in my father's hospital room, I need you to understand something about my family. We were not the kind of people who talked about money. We were the kind of people who smiled at Thanksgiving and pretended the tension at the table was just the weather. My father built his roofing business from nothing. 31 years of climbing ladders in the Texas heat, of calloused hands and sunburned necks, of driving the same truck until the transmission gave out twice and he fixed it himself both times. He always said the business would be there for all of us when the time came. I never thought to ask which one of us he meant. I'm the younger one. That's the first thing you need to know. My brother is 4 years older, smoother around the edges, the kind of guy who knows how to walk into a room and make everyone feel like they'd been waiting for him. He went to college. I went to work alongside my father. I learned the trade. I learned the schedule, the crews, the clients, the margins. I thought that meant something. I was 28 years old before I understood it didn't. My brother moved back to our hometown about 3 years ago. He brought his wife with him. She's the kind of woman who calls everything our journey and smiles too wide when she's about to ask for something. They settled into a house 20 minutes from my parents. I was living on the same street as my father's shop. My mother called me every Sunday. My brother called when he needed something. I want to be fair. I want to say he wasn't always like this, but the truth is I don't know anymore. Maybe I just stopped noticing. The call came on a Wednesday in March. It was my mother. Her voice was wrong, not panicked, which would have been easier to understand, just flat, empty in the way a room sounds after furniture has been moved out of it. She said my father had collapsed at the shop. She said the ambulance had already come. She said I should drive to St. Augustine Medical, and when I asked if he was okay, there was a pause that lasted too long and she said, "Just come." I drove 40 minutes in 26. I remember nothing about that drive, except the moment I pulled into the parking lot and realized my brother's car was already there, and something in my chest went tight for a reason I couldn't name yet. My father had had a stroke, not catastrophic. The doctors used words like moderate and stable and monitoring, but serious enough that he was in the ICU, serious enough that he couldn't speak clearly, serious enough that his right hand, the hand he'd used to hold a nail gun for 3 decades, had gone weak and uncertain. He was 63 years old and he looked, for the first time in my life, like someone who could be broken. My mother sat beside his bed and held his left hand, and I stood in the doorway for a long moment before I went in. My brother was in the hallway talking on his phone. He held up one finger at me, 1 second, and kept talking. That was the first day. The second and third days were a blur of coffee from machines and chairs that were not made for sleeping, and doctors explaining things in language designed to be understood but somehow never was. My father improved slightly. He could say a few words. He knew who we were. The doctors said recovery would take time, said he would need rehabilitation, said it was too early to know how much function he would regain. On the 4th day, my brother pulled me into the hallway near the vending machines and told me we needed to talk about the business. I remember thinking it was too soon. I remember thinking my father was still in a hospital bed 30 feet away, but my brother had that look on his face, the organized one, the prepared one, the one that meant he had already thought further ahead than I had, and he wanted me to catch up quickly. He said our father had already spoken to him, before the stroke, months before. He said the plan had always been for him to take over the operational side of the business, because he had the business degree, because he understood finance, because, and here he paused just a half second too long, because someone had to be the one making real decisions. I asked him what that meant for me. He said I could stay on as crew lead, same as I'd been doing. He said it like he was offering me something. I didn't say anything. I bought a bag of pretzels I didn't eat and went back into my father's room and sat there for 2 hours not saying much, just watching my father sleep, trying to figure out if the feeling in my stomach was grief or something else entirely. It was my mother who said it first, 3 days later in the parking garage, in the 20 seconds between when my brother's car turned the corner and when mine wouldn't. She said, "He's been to see the attorney already." I turned the key again. The engine caught. I asked her what she meant. She said my brother had gone to my father's attorney 2 weeks before the stroke. She said she didn't know what was discussed. She said my father had mentioned it afterward, something about updating documents, something about making things cleaner. She said she hadn't asked questions because she didn't want to seem like she was prying into the business. My mother has never pried into the business in 40 years of marriage. It is both her greatest loyalty and the thing that nearly undid everything. I did not sleep well that night. What I did instead was think. I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and I wrote down everything I knew about the business finances. I had access to the scheduling software and the job tracker. I had the vendor contacts saved in my phone. What I did not have was access to the business bank accounts. Because 3 years ago, my father had restructured things, and I had been so busy running crews that I hadn't pushed back when my name wasn't added to the new accounts. That was my mistake. I own it. The next morning, I drove to the shop before anyone else arrived. I have a key. I've had a key for 7 years. I went to the filing room in the back, the one that always smelled like old coffee and printer toner, and I started looking. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. That's the honest answer. I was running on bad sleep and worse instincts, and something my mother had said was sitting in my chest like a stone. I pulled out the current year's binder first, then last year's. Then I found something that stopped me. It was a folder, manila, unmarked, tucked behind the binders in a way that felt deliberate. Inside were printouts, bank statements from an account I didn't recognize, not the main operating account I knew, not the payroll account, but a third account I had never seen mentioned anywhere. The statements went back 14 months. The deposits were regular, large. I stood in that filing room for a long time. I'm not an accountant. I want to be clear about that. I didn't fully understand what I was looking at, but I understood enough. Money had been moving out of the main business account in amounts that were labeled in the ledger as consulting fees. The consulting fees went to a company I had never heard of, and the statements in the folder showed that company's account, the one receiving those fees, held at a different bank. I took photos of everything with my phone, every page. Then I went and got a cup of coffee and sat in my truck in the parking lot and called the only attorney I knew, a woman I'd gone to high school with who had gone on to handle small business law in the city. I hadn't spoken to her in 2 years. She answered on the third ring and I said, "I need to ask you something and I need you to tell me if I'm reading this wrong." She called back 4 hours later after I'd sent her the photos. She did not tell me I was reading it wrong. She told me that what I was describing, a pattern of transfers from a business to a consulting entity without documented services, in a context where one family member had recently visited an estate attorney, was something I should take seriously. She said I should not confront anyone yet. She said I should document everything. She said I should find out what changes, if any, had been made to my father's will or the business ownership structure. I asked her how I would find that out. She said, "Find out who the attorney is, and then request a meeting. You have standing as a potential heir." My father's attorney was a man named, well, I'll just say, he'd done work for our family for 15 years. His office was in a low brick building near the courthouse. I called that afternoon and said I was Raymond Calloway's son, and I needed to review some estate matters given my father's current medical condition. The receptionist put me on hold twice. Then she gave me an appointment for the following Tuesday. I did not tell my brother. I did not tell my mother, because telling my mother would have meant putting something in her hands she didn't know how to carry right now. Not with my father still in the hospital, not with everything else. I told her I was handling some business paperwork, and she nodded and went back to her knitting, and I felt the particular loneliness of protecting someone who doesn't know they need protecting. Tuesday came. The attorney's office smelled like old paper and central air conditioning. He was a deliberate man, careful with his words, the kind of man who tells you things in the order he decides and not the order you want. He looked at me across his desk for a moment before he said anything. He said my father had come in for a consultation 8 weeks before the stroke. He said my father had expressed an intent to update his estate documents. He said at that point in time, no changes had been finalized and signed. I asked him if anyone else had come in. He said my brother had accompanied my father to that first meeting. I asked if my brother had come in separately, without my father. There was a pause. He said he couldn't discuss other clients. I noted that he had not said no. I asked about the business ownership structure. He explained that the business was currently held under my father's name as a sole proprietor, with a succession note in his will leaving the business to both sons equally. He said that succession note had not been changed. He said he wanted to be very clear about that, and I understood, without him having to explain further, that he was being clear for a reason. I thanked him and left. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before I drove back to the hospital. When I walked into my father's room that afternoon, my brother was already there. His wife was sitting in the corner chair. She smiled at me with the wide smile. My father was more alert that day, Better color, tracking conversation, getting his words out slowly but getting them out. My brother was talking about the spring contracts, about which crews were scheduled where. He was talking about the business like it was already his. I watched my father's face while my brother talked. My father looked tired in a specific way, not the tired of illness, the tired of something else. I came back the next morning alone, early before visiting hours technically started. The nurse who knew me let me in. My father was awake. We didn't talk about the business at first. We talked about a job he'd done back when I was 12, a commercial roof on a warehouse outside of Abilene, one of the first big contracts he'd ever landed. He remembered the color of the sky that week. He remembered what he'd paid his crew. He remembered driving home on the last day and stopping at a gas station and buying himself a bottle of Coke and drinking it standing next to his truck because he'd done something hard and it was finished and he was proud. I let him tell the whole story. Then I said quietly, "Dad, I need to ask you something." He looked at me. I asked him if he had made changes to his will. I asked him if the business was still going to both of us, the way he'd always said. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said it should be. I asked him what he meant. He said he had gone in to update some things. He said he had meant to. He said after the consultation he'd wanted to think it over more before he signed anything. I asked him if he had signed anything. He said he didn't think so. He said things had gotten busy and then he gestured, vaguely, toward himself, and then this. I told him about the account. I told him about the consulting fees. I kept my voice level. I watched his face. My father is not a man who cries. In 32 years of my life, I had seen it twice. He didn't cry then. But something shifted in his expression, something behind his eyes, and he turned his face toward the window for a long moment. Then he said my brother's name. Just the name, nothing after it, like a sentence that didn't need a period. I told him I wasn't there to ask him to choose. I told him I had an attorney helping me understand the legal picture. I told him the most important thing right now was him getting better, and that was true. It was true even when I was angry. Even when I was sitting there with a legal pad full of notes and photos of financial documents on my phone. He was my father. He was alive. Everything else was paper. He reached out his left hand, the good one, and put it on my forearm. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. What came next happened over several weeks, and I won't pretend it was clean or simple because it wasn't. My attorney filed a formal request for financial records from the business on my behalf as a named heir. The consulting company, when we traced it, was registered to a holding entity connected to my brother's wife. 14 months of transfers. The total was not a small number. My brother called me when the paperwork arrived. He was not using his smooth voice. He was using a different one, tighter, faster, the one people use when they are not quite sure how far the ground goes before it drops. He said I was overreacting. He said this was a compensation structure he and my father had agreed on verbally. He said I was making a family matter into a legal matter, and I should think about what that meant. I said I was thinking about exactly what it meant. He said my father was in a hospital bed, and this was not the time. I said my father had been in that attorney's office 8 weeks ago, and apparently that had been the time just fine. He hung up. My father formally gave his attorney instruction, once he was coherent enough to do so clearly, that no changes to the estate documents were to be made without my presence and without documentation. He also signed a letter authorizing his accountant to cooperate with my attorney's records request. The accountant, it turned out, had concerns of his own that he had not known how to raise. What the records showed, formally documented, was that $73,000 had been transferred from the business operating account to the consulting entity over 14 months. The consulting entity had no registered services contract with the business. There were no deliverables documented. There were no invoices, just transfers, labeled consulting, moving money out of the business my father had built and into an account his oldest son's wife controlled. My brother's attorney reached out to my attorney in the 6th week. They wanted to discuss resolution. That's the word they used, resolution. My attorney told them we were open to a conversation. She also told them that she had been in contact with the county DA's office regarding potential financial elder abuse statutes, which in Texas carry specific provisions when the victim is over 60 and the accused is a family member in a position of trust. The call was short. Resolution in the end looked like this: a formal repayment agreement, structured over 36 months, for the full $73,000 plus interest. A revised business succession document, signed by my father while I was in the room and his attorney was present, and a notary was there. confirming equal ownership transfer to both sons, with explicit provisions that any management compensation required documented board approval, meaning my father's approval, in writing, while he was living. My brother and his wife did not contest it. I don't think they thought I would go as far as I went. I don't think they thought I knew how. That's the thing about being underestimated your whole life. People forget that quiet is not the same as unaware. My father came home in May. The rehabilitation took longer than the doctors initially hoped, but he got more back than they thought he would. His right hand is not what it was, but it works. He was at the shop last week, not climbing but walking the lot, talking to the crew lead, checking the schedule, watching. He called me that evening. He said, "You were there." I said, "Of course I was." He said it again, slower. "No, you were always there. I should have seen it better." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say much. Some things don't need a response. Some things just need to be heard. My brother and I don't have Sunday dinners anymore. I don't know if we ever will again. That's a grief I'm still learning to carry, not for who he is now, but for who I thought he was for most of my life. The version of him I grew up beside. I don't know how much of that was real and how much was a story I told myself because it was easier than the truth. His wife called my mother once after everything was settled. My mother said the conversation lasted 4 minutes. She didn't tell me what was said. I didn't ask. What I know is this: my father built something real. 31 years of showing up, doing the work, keeping his word. That's the thing my brother tried to take, and that's the thing that's still standing. I still have a key to the shop. I still know the schedules and the crews and the clients and the margins. My name is on the succession documents now, in writing, in front of witnesses. And on the days when the work is hard, when the heat is brutal and the crew is short, and a contract falls through, and everything feels like it's happening at once, I think about my father buying that bottle of Coke outside a gas station in Abilene, standing next to his truck in the last light, proud and tired and finished with something difficult. I understand that now in a way I didn't before. Some things you have to earn, and some things you have to fight to keep. Sometimes, if you're paying attention, those two things turn out to be the same thing.